Hi guys, this is chapter 13, Achieving Energy Sustainability. The opening case study asks the question, what kind of energy is obtained from moon power? And the answer is tidal energy. Roosevelt Island Tidal Energy Project is a project that generates 35 megawatt hours of kinetic energy of moving water that's captured and converted as the water flows through underwater turbines, just like wind would through windmills. This moon-driven energy is a continuous source of clean energy and provides enough energy for about 8 New York residences for 1 year. In comparison, most fossil fuel plants produce about 500 megawatts. The benefits of tidal energy is that it's invisible. The particular turbines that they use are mesh enclosed, so it protects fish. It's close to shore and operates pretty silently. The energy is predictable because it's based on the continuous tidal movement in the ocean. Again, it's clean and it can be strategically placed near populated areas to supplement other forms of energy. So the chapter really is going to discuss the differences between the different kinds of renewable energy we have available to us. And renewable energy is energy that can be rapidly regenerated, and some can never be depleted no matter how much of it we use. Some examples would be solar, wind, geothermal, hydroelectric, and tidal. Potentially renewable energy is energy that, as long as we don't use it up faster than it can be replenished, it will still remain, like biomass. Here's a picture of the different kinds of energies that we have talked about and will discuss in this chapter. So we've learned that natural gas, oil, coal, and nuclear are all non-renewable energies. Some of the potentially renewables, again, would be the wood and the biofuels, and the non-depletable, meaning they will not run out, are the wind, solar, hydroelectric, and geothermal. So can we become less energy, or can we become more energy efficient? The answer is yes. We can do this through several different methods. We can winterize our homes, which would mean insulating and sealing gaps, turning our thermostats down in the winter and up in the summer, reducing our use of hot water when we do our laundry, so using cold water when we wash our clothes and taking shorter showers, replacing the old incandescent bulbs with CFLs, which are compact fluorescent light bulbs, or LEDs. We can also change our transportation methods. We can walk or ride a bike, take public transportation, carpool, or consolidate our trips. With regard to our appliances and electronic devices, we can buy Energy Star devices and appliances we can unplug when we're not using them, or use a power strip to cut the circuit, and using laptops rather than desktops. So another thing that we can do is use our appliances in the periods that are not considered peak demand time. So peak demand is when most people are using their appliances and there's a greater demand on energy. So that would be during the days. So a lesser peak demand time, so the more energy efficient time would be in the middle of the night. Most people are asleep. But if you have an Energy Star appliance, you can sometimes have the ability to program those appliances to turn on during those times in the middle of the night when it's not peak demand. You can save money, and some energy companies will actually give you money back if you're using those appliances in the non-peak demand times. So some other things we can do is we can incorporate sustainable design into the buildings we live and work in. We can incorporate passive solar, which is south-facing windows and rooms with stone walls and floors. We can utilize dark roofs and walls that absorb thermal heat and reflect light. We can use overhanging roofs and window shades in the summer. We can use materials to build our homes and our businesses that have high thermal inertia. Those are materials that stay warm and cold for longer periods of time. We can build on the sides of hills, which would provide natural insulation. We can utilize green roofs, which can cool and insulate buildings, add air quality, grow plants, and can capture rain that can be used to recharge groundwater or used for watering lawns. We can use recycled building materials such as recycled denim for insulation, and fly ash, which can be used to help build the cement for foundations. We can also incorporate natural skylights or natural lighting in the form of skylights that are strategically placed to use natural light. So in this image, you can see some of these different methods. So skylights, high energy efficient windows, adequate insulation in the ceiling of cracks in the homes, using high efficiency heating and cooling systems, and insulating the foundations of your home. Passive solar energy can lower your electricity bill without the need for pumps and other mechanical devices. And so some of the things that we just talked about are very important, because a lot of people don't realize that just by incorporating them or remodeling a home to incorporate these methods can really diminish the amount of money you're sending to the electrical company. So, for example, in the overhanging roofs that I spoke about before, in the winter, the overhanging roof is at an angle where the sun can still penetrate a heat-absorbing floor. But in the summer, that overhanging roof would protect that room, because you wouldn't want it to be heated to a warmer temperature in the summer. You would want it to be cooled. So you can see that the angle of the sun, because it's lower in the winter and higher in the summer, and we learned this in chapter 4, because of that oblique angle in the winter, it's not as direct. But in the summer, when it's directly overhead, it's a lot more intense. So it's good to provide that overhanging roof and also window shades to protect the rooms inside. This is a pretty amazing building in California. It's the California Academy of Sciences building, where they've incorporated sustainable design by utilizing natural light and ventilation. They generate their own electricity with solar panels, and they've used recycled denim for the insulation, and they can capture water on the rooftop garden that they use to recharge groundwater stores beneath. You can read more about this on page 349 and 350. Biomass is energy from the sun, and it's the first most common source of renewable energy, accounting for about 10% of world consumption. So the sun is the ultimate source of almost all types of energy, both renewable and non-renewable. The only sources of energy not driven by the sun are geothermal, tidal, nuclear fission, and fusion. So if we take a look at this chart, we can see these top two boxes, the orange and the green, is energy that directly comes from the sun. So let's look at fossil fuels. This would be petroleum, natural gas, coal, and peat. All of those forms of energy that we talked about in chapter 12 have been derived through the photosynthesis of ancient plants and algae that were buried over millions of years and then formed these different types of energy. Renewable energy is also a direct result of the energy of the sun. So for example, solar is just direct solar energy from the sun, but wind and hydroelectric is due to the differential heating of the atmosphere. Ground source heat pumps is due to the heating of the ground that comes from the sun. And then wood, which can be turned into charcoal, and other plants that we use for biofuels or maybe for manure, is a direct result of photosynthesis by modern plants and algae. The only energy that's not driven by the sun, as I mentioned before, would be nuclear fission, nuclear fusion, geothermal, and tidal. So modern carbon versus fossil carbon. So a lot of people are confused about how burning biomass, such as wood, is better than burning coal. And when I say better, please understand, I don't mean better in that it's more energy efficient. When we want to look at better, we want to look at, is something energy efficient, and does it release greenhouse gas emissions? So carbon found in biomass like trees or corn was in the atmosphere recently as carbon dioxide, and then it was taken in by the tree or by the corn plant. And then when we burn it, we put it back into the atmosphere. But when we burn coal, the carbon that was caught up in coal millions of years ago and buried for millions of years has been out of circulation until recently, when we either mined it from down below the surface of the earth or from the surface of the earth. And then when we burn it, it's creating what can be called actually a carbon bomb, because it's a rapid increase or release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so modern carbon, again, are the plants that you would find growing today, and fossil carbon is the carbon in fossil fuels that have been buried for millions of years. Any activity that is carbon neutral is an activity that does not change the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So what I mean by that, let me go back for a second. For example, like if we know that burning a certain amount of coal releases X amount of carbon, could we plant trees to counteract that amount of carbon? And by planting the trees, those trees would then take in excess carbon dioxide through the process of photosynthesis. That would be an activity that would be promoting carbon neutrality. So biomass can come in the form of wood, charcoal, animal products, and manure, plant remains, municipal solid waste, which is just garbage, from humans, and liquid fuels like ethanol and biodiesel. Wood, charcoal, and manure have been used to heat homes throughout the world. Ethanol and biodiesels, which are also called biofuels, are used as substitutes for gasoline and diesel fuel. 2/3 of biomass in the U.S. comes from wood, and 1/3 of biomass in the U.S. is divided evenly between solid waste, so municipal solid waste, and liquid fuels like ethanol and diesel fuel. This is an image of a man in a charcoal market in the Philippines where they've collected charcoal. Charcoal in those areas is used for cooking and heating. And this picture on the bottom right is an area that was denuded for charcoal production. So you can click on this, how to make charcoal, if you want to. But in general, what you can do to make lump charcoal is by taking pieces of wood, so cutting down trees, and cutting those branches into small pieces and putting them in a container and then burning around it for a long period of time. And I think it takes anywhere from 8 to 12 hours to remove the water and the impurities from the wood. And what it really does is it shrinks those chunks of wood into really dense pieces, just like you see here. And then now it's considered charcoal. If you were to take this little piece right here, I don't know if you can see this with my mouse, but this piece of charcoal, and if you had that same piece before it was turned to charcoal as wood, the wood would burn up very fast, but the charcoal burns very slow because all the air pockets and water and impurities have been squeezed out of it through this process of making the charcoal. Ethanol and biodiesel can be used, as I said earlier, as substitutes for gasoline and diesel. These are products that come from fossil fuels. So ethanol is an alcohol. It's made by converting the starches and sugars from plants into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The U.S. is the leader in this and in the production of ethanol. Gasohol is 10% ethanol and 90% gasoline, so it's kind of a mix of the two. E85 is 85% ethanol and only 15% gasoline. So E85 comes mostly from plants that are modern day plants. And then flex fuel vehicles are those vehicles that can run on either gasoline or E85. 90% of biofuels come from corn and corn byproducts. Corn and sugarcane produce most of the ethanol because they're more easily, they have a higher content of sugar. But researchers are looking at perennial switchgrass as an alternative to corn. And the reason is because growing switchgrass results in a lot less soil disturbance and erosion and requires less fossil fuels input to produce. The only problem with switchgrass is that it's primarily made of cellulose, which has to be broken down into sugar before it can be used. So that process requires some energy. But when you grow corn, for example, you have to plant the corn. You've got to yield the corn, and then once you're done with the corn, you cut the corn stalks off. Then you got to, chop it up and then turn the soil over and plant again. So the differences between using corn versus switchgrass is that the switchgrass, you're just cutting the top off. You're not removing the root system. So it has less of an impact on the soil. Biodiesel is a substitute for regular petroleum diesel, and it's produced by extracting oil from algae and plants such as soybeans, palm, and vegetable oil. B20 is 80% petroleum diesel and 20% biodiesel. You can also use restaurant waste oil, which is SVO or straight vegetable oil, and it's been used in car engines to actually run the engines. Some other potential biofuel sources are waste wood from logging and sawmills. Algae can also produce a great yield of fuel per hectare of land. It actually can produce the greatest yield, I should say. And it utilizes the least amount of energy and fertilizer per quantity of fuel because it can be grown on marginal lands or brackish water and rooftops, and the emissions of CO2 are lower than that of petroleum diesel. So hydroelectricity is generating energy through the use of water, and so it's the kinetic energy of the moving water that is captured. It's the second most common form of renewable energy in the U.S. and the world, and it accounts for 7% of the energy generated in the U.S. and 20% in the world. More than half of the electricity in the U.S. comes from the states of Washington, California, and Oregon. This is what a dam or a hydroelectric facility might look like with the use of a dam. So a river would be dammed up. This would take a lot of cement to build this hydroelectric dam. And what it does is it stops the water behind it. We call this an impoundment system. So the water is impounded behind the dam and it creates this reservoir. And as the water flows down below, it flows through the bottom of the dam, and it's turning turbines just like it would a windmill or just like in a coal-fired power plant. And as it turns, that turbine, as the water flows by, it turns the crank in the generator that generates the electricity, and then that's transferred to transmission lines and to the grid where it can be sent out to homes and businesses. So it's once the dam is built or the impoundment system is built, it's free energy. It doesn't emit any fossil fuels, but it does take a lot of fossil fuels in the process of making the dam. They're very intensive processes to make these dams. There's another type of system besides the water impoundment system, and it's called the run-of-the-river system, which is water that's not held behind a dam, but actually runs through the river channel where there is a turbine. Some negatives of this is that could be intermittent flow due to weather conditions that fluctuate, so the generation could be intermittent. But it has less environmental impact. There's no flooding behind the dam, and the seasonal flow to the river is not disrupted. When we look at water impoundment systems behind a dam, they're really wonderful because they can generate a lot of electricity. So the Grand Coulee Dam in Washington is the largest in the United States, and it can generate about 6,800 megawatts. But the Yangtze River in China is the largest in the world, and it generates 18,000 megawatts of energy. Some other systems are the tidal systems that we talked about at the opening case study, where water is driven by the gravitational pull of the moon and captured through turbines in a similar system. I do want to talk a little bit about the negatives of the water impoundment system. When we store the water behind the dam, it slows the water down, and it's lacking in oxygen. So fish species that would depend on a lot of oxygen would not be able to survive there. The other thing that happens is that as the water moves towards that impoundment system, it brings with it silt that can build up and push against the dam itself. This happened actually in Cheeseman Canyon and Waterton Canyon. They shut Waterton Canyon down several years ago because they had to go in there and dig out all the siltation that had occurred behind the dam. The other thing about water impoundment systems is that it disrupts ecological systems, and there's a loss of habitat for some species. And even though we might use fish ladders like we talked about in our water unit, not a lot of fish species actually utilize those fish ladders, and predators have become smart, and they will wait in those areas for fish to utilize the fish ladders to get to their spawning grounds. So there's some negatives to that. The other thing that can happen too is that you can have a void of water downstream, and you can have flooding behind the dam. So those were kind of the things that I just talked about. Let's see, what else have I not talked on? So once the dam is built, I did say that it requires no fossil fuels to run, and they can generate lots of energy. Oh, the other thing is that dams can provide recreational and economic opportunities like jobs. And then it can control floods. I know that in India, every year, in China, every year on the Yangtze River, before they put the Three Gorges Dam in, people would die because of seasonal flooding that they never knew was coming. But then when they put the dam in, that saved lives, And then some cons with the hydroelectricity is that it can flood thousands of hectares. It can force people to relocate. It can submerge ancient lands. It changes ecosystems and lowers the dissolved oxygen behind those big dams. Sandbars can occur after the flooding downstream, which can affect cottonwoods, and different organism species of species. Life cycles are disrupted. And like I said, the production of cement is a big carbon dioxide emitter. And the flooded soils can release methane. So the soils behind the dam that become flooded, when the plants, cyclically grow and die, they fall down into these the area of the water that's dammed up, and then that environment becomes anaerobic, and that's what releases methane. And then, like I said, siltation on the bottom of the reservoir. So solar energy is capturing the sun's energy directly or indirectly. So passive solar would be indirectly and without the use of pumps or technology. And active solar is actually using a pump or photovoltaic cells in the generation of the electricity. So here's an example of a woman in Chad who is using a solar oven to heat water and cook her food. What's nice about this, especially in areas where refugees have to live, is that it reduces the need for them to travel outside the camp where there could be threats to their lives. Active solar is an interesting way for us to get energy for different things. For example, a solar domestic hot water system. This occurs when you've got non-freezing liquid that circulates by the use of a pump and this closed loop system. So you can see it here. And what happens is the water is moved, it's pumped up to the surface where it heats up and then returns where it can heat water. I actually have this in my house. So we have 3 of these systems on our roof. And as the water gets pumped up there, we just pump water up there. And then the water comes back down. But in our house, it actually heats our house. We have a system where we have copper piping around all the rooms in our home. And this water that's getting heated on the roof then is pumped through the house. And that's our hot water, or I'm sorry, that's our hot air. So it's not a forced air. It's just radiant heat that radiates from that copper pipe. And then over here we have photovoltaic system where you have panels on the roof that actually capture the sun's light energy at where it's sent from the rooftop down to an inverter where it's turned from DC into AC. We cannot use electricity that's DC in our homes. We have to have an inverter that converts it to AC, and then we can actually use it. We can plug, our appliances into our outlets and capture that energy and use it. Anything that we don't use can get sent to the grid, and then sometimes electric companies will give you rebates on your electricity bill if you're creating more energy electrically than you're using. Here's a home in California that has photovoltaic panels on their roof. And what's great about this home is that they're providing about 4,200 kilowatt hours of electricity per year, which is about just what this family needs. This is a CST, a concentrating solar thermal system. It's a large-scale application of solar energy that can generate electricity. So it uses all these little mirrors that will actually move with the sun, the direction of the sun throughout the day. And it focuses that sun's light energy as a beam onto a small area that can then heat water and produce steam that can turn a turbine and generate electricity. This is a great application for areas where it's poor habitat, like in the desert, but you have intense and pretty consistent sunlight. Some of the benefits and drawbacks of active solar energy are that the benefits can be that there's no air pollution. So it's electricity without air pollution, electricity without water pollution. The CO2 emissions are only in the process of building the application, so building the photovoltaic cells or the water cycles. Reducing the need for new fossil fuel power plants, and it's also more economical. Some of the drawbacks are that the panels can be very expensive. A lot of people haven't converted because they feel it's too much money. Installation is difficult and the payback period could be long. The manufacturing of some of the different components requires emissions, and that can release toxic metals and chemicals into the atmosphere. You also have to have some kind of battery storage to hold on to the energy of the electricity. Otherwise, it just goes away. So you have to have those batteries to store it. And the problem with the batteries is that they eventually have an end of life, and they have to be reclaimed or recycled, which is kind of a problem because now you might have toxic chemicals that you have to deal with. The third most common renewable energy is geothermal, and it's using the heat from natural radioactive decay of elements deep within the earth, as well as heat coming up from the earth to generate electricity or heat. And so this might come in the form from geysers and hot springs. It's where we use hot water that's pumped directly into household radiators that can just radiate heat. We can use heat exchangers that circulate cold surface water underground where it is heated. And we can also use geothermal energy to generate electricity because steam can turn turbines. Groundwater is non-renewable, so even though the radioactive decay continues constantly, once that groundwater comes up, it then becomes part of the current water cycle and it's not recaptured. 20% of the electricity in Iceland is geothermal, and there are some hazardous gases and steam that can be emitted from these. So here's an example of something that you might not be familiar with. These are called ground source heat pumps. So what it does is it takes advantage of the ambient temperature of the ground that's about 10 feet below the surface. So if you can see that this is the surface of the earth and this house is sitting on it. And what they've done is they've developed a pipe system where they're running liquid. And it could be liquid or it can be air. I know that sometimes it's liquid and sometimes it's air. This one talks about air that's being circulated. But what happens basically is that you take this cold air and you pump it down and it heats up. And it's, like I said, heat or water. And then it comes back up to the compressor. And then that heat, the heat from that water or that air can then be emitted into the house. Why this is really great is that the ambient temperature is about between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And it stays that way throughout the year, even if it's the heat of the summer or the freezing cold of the winter. At about 10 feet below the surface, it's always that same temperature. So think about that logically. If the temperature outside your house in the winter is 0 degrees, and you can just pump this energy, or I'm sorry, this air or this water down to that level, it's going to heat that, it's going to heat that water or that air up to 50 degrees or 60 degrees. And then when it comes back into the house, if you want to warm your room up to about 68 degrees, you only have to go maybe 8 degrees. So you're paying for a lot less energy than you would if you had to go from 0 degrees, which is the temperature outside, to 68 degrees. And likewise in the summer, if it's 105 degrees outside and you bring this cool air or cool water below the surface and it warms it up to, or cools it down, I should say, to 50 or 60 degrees, then you're only having to cool your air temperature with your air conditioner, 20, 30 degrees instead of, 100 degrees. So both of those instances take advantage of the ground source heat and ambient temperature that's about 10 feet below the surface of the earth. Wind energy is the most rapidly growing source of electricity. And wind is the result of unequal heating of the Earth's surface by the sun. So as warm air rises and it cools and dense air sinks, we create circulating patterns on the Earth. And that's what drives our wind patterns. In the 1920s, windmills dotted the landscape of the United States, and they used that to do all kinds of things with electricity. In the U.S., California and Texas have the largest wind energy generating capacity. And in Denmark, wind energy accounts for 21% of their electricity generation. A wind turbine itself is pretty interesting. I'm sure you've seen these either standing, if you drive south in Colorado towards Pueblo and even further south, you'll see wind generation farms. And you've got these large wind turbines, and inside you've got this gearbox that transfer the mechanical energy to the generator. In most of these, you have an elevator that's inside so that mechanics can get up here and check on how things are going. But you've got the blades and you've got the direction of the wind turning, and that's turning a crank inside the generator that's generating electricity. Some advantages of wind turbines is that we can have offshore wind parks in the ocean, like we talked about earlier. It's renewable, 100% renewable. So once you have the generation occurring, you're not releasing any fossil fuels. You can have these in areas where you have grazing animals, so you can use the land for multiple purposes. And some disadvantages are that the batteries to store the electricity are required, and they have to be quite large. They can be noisy. They're not aesthetical. A lot of people don't like the way that they look. That's the aesthetics of it. And there can be bird and bat collisions, and approximately 40,000 birds a year are killed for every 4 turbines, so about 10,000 birds per turbine. Here's an image of an offshore wind park in Denmark. And just to know that the global growth of installed wind energy is growing. You can see from 1996 to 2008, just in that period of time, how much wind energy has transformed. Another type of renewable energy is hydrogen fuel cells, and they have some potential applications. It's a device that operates like a common battery where electricity is generated by a reaction between 2 chemicals. In common batteries or conventional batteries that we use, electricity occurs by a reaction between nickel and cadmium in a closed container. But when those reactants are used up, the battery goes dead. I know that you guys have dead batteries probably hanging around your house just like I do. But a fuel cell is different. The reactants are added so that the cell produces electricity for as long as those reactants are supplied. So here's an example of how it works. Energy forms when you take 2 molecules of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen. It produces energy and water. But the problem is that it requires a supply of hydrogen, which is very rare in nature and explosive. So heating, or we can use a heating process or electricity to break the bonds of water or methane to liberate hydrogen molecules. And when we do that, it's called electrolysis. Electrolysis is running an electrical current through water, for example, to break hydrogen and oxygen apart. So that could be a source of hydrogen for the energy you would need for a fuel cell, but you would have to have a constant supply of that water. And this is an example. It could be used in a fuel cell vehicle. So if you want to look at this just explains how that can happen. The very last chart that I want to show you from the chapter is a comparison of what I've just gone over of all the different types of renewable energy resources. It gives you the advantages, the disadvantages, the emissions, which are the pollutants and greenhouse gases that happen because of these energies, the cost of the electricity that's generated, and the ROEI, the return on energy invested. It's hard for me to say for a second. And then how can we become more smart about the energy that we use? We can use smart grids. So a smart grid is something that you can incorporate into your house. You can have smart appliances and utilize computers and the internet to distribute the electricity to your appliances when we need them. So again, we can utilize those appliances during a non-peak demand times. And we can also use large numbers of small-scale electricity generation parks rather than large regional electricity generation plants. And when we use that small idea of small parks, we save money by transporting electricity shorter distances, and it results in less energy loss. Remember, I told you that electricity generation is about only 35% efficient. But if we use these smaller parks, then you're transporting that electricity in shorter spans, and so there's a lot less energy that's lost. And we can utilize the smart house design like this, using computers, like I said, smart appliances, high-speed internet to control the appliances that we used, and smart thermometers and smart electricity. An alternative to energy in a society that's really fashionable is Iceland. They use geothermal to heat their homes, and they utilize hydrogen for hydrogen-fueled cars, and their bus system uses electrolysis to split that water, liberating the hydrogen and the oxygen and forming energy. That's it, guys, for chapter 13. Let me know if you have any questions.